Hi, thanks for taking a few moments as I introduce and demonstrate a new tool from IBM tailored to accelerate your microservices end-to-end development lifecycle. Microclimate is an end-to-end development environment that lets you rapidly create, edit, and deploy microservices to IBM Cloud Private. The microservices run in containers from day one and can be delivered into production on Kubernetes through an integrated DevOps pipeline using Jenkins. Microclimate can be installed locally or to IBM Cloud Private. So there's two ways to get started with microservices using microclimate. You could import an existing Maven project, or you can create a new project from one of the many templates that are available in microclimate. In this demo, we're going to use the new project creation wizard and instantiate or create a Java-based microservice. I'm going to give it a name stock quote demo. And I'm going to select that we're going to use this as a Java EE microprofile template. The other option is a Spring framework. So it takes a couple minutes for the project to create and get started. What Microclimate's doing now is after generating the project source files, it is going to then go off and create the Docker image and deploy that image as a container into the running environment. And I'll see that my stock quote demo project is actually in the running state. Clicking on the project, I can do a couple of things inside of Microclimate. One, I could use the embedded Thea editor to look at and edit the code and the artifacts within the project. So there's a source folder that it created for me. It created a chart folder for the Kubernetes deployment. It created a JMeter load test script for me. And it also created a placeholder for a REST service inside of the project. It also created some additional files that are needed for the containerized and DevOps pipeline builds, such as a Docker file, a Jenkins file, and it also created the Maven build file for me, the pom.xml file. We can use the integrated web-based editor, the Thea editor, to edit our code if we like. In this case, the default template created a file for me called example.java. Now we're not going to use this particular piece of code. We're going to import and overlay this with our application logic. To add the business logic to our project, I've created a simple script that I can run, that I can just add the business logic to the project. And again, back in the Thea editor, I can use the editor to edit the code. And what you'll notice at the moment is that the project is now not in the running state. And that's because when I modified the code, Microclimate detected the code changes and then knew that it needed to kick off an additional Maven build and redeploy the application to the container. So it takes just a couple of seconds. The application is now back up. And I can modify the code using this Thea editor. And so I wanted to let you know that you could also use your own favorite integrated development environment or editor. I chose Atom. I think Atom's a pretty easy editor to use. And so any of the code changes that you make to your application in the project in your editor or IDE would also be reflected inside of the Microclimate environment. So one of the easy things to do is I could just add the project to my editor and then continue along my development process using my own favorite editor. So for example, back into Microclimate, once we've seen the application's been deployed, we can test our application by invoking the appropriate endpoint. And we'll see that this application, where he simulates a stock quote price and symbol, and additionally adds the number of retries that it took to run. And sometimes the application runs, and sometimes the application fails with a runtime exception. And so back in my editor, right, to showcase that we can integrate with our own IDE, I can make the code changes in my Atom editor. And in this case, what I want to do is I want to remove the comment for this microprofile retry in the case where we can specify some number of retries in the hope that the application or the microservice would run on subsequent retries. So I've made the code changes, and the microclimate now will go off and detect that those changes has occurred and that it needs to kick off another build. So what we'll notice now is by introducing that code change using the microprofile retry, my application will continue to run, not produce the errors back to the end user. Another key feature in Microclimate is the ability to run a load test in your development environment in a container. And so the cool thing about this is you can sort of get the idea of how well your application or your microservice is running long before it gets deployed to a shared environment. So here we get the ability to see how well our application performs. And this is live data. And so this is the dashboard. I've created a little JMeter script that just ran a couple of users about 25 times. And so this will just run approximately 50 iterations of the stock quote endpoint. The other thing we can do is start working with integrated pipelines. The pipeline in Microclimate wants us to have a repository location for our code. So once we're happy that our code's been tested, it works, then we would check it into a Git repository, and we would be able to point to this repository location, and the Microclimate would automatically create the pipeline for us to deploy it to the containerized environment in IBM Cloud Private. All right, so to demonstrate the integrated pipeline in Microclimate, what I did is I checked in the code from my project into a local GitLab repository. So creating the pipeline in Microclimate is quite simple. Basically, we point to the existing Git repository, provide the credentials we need to access the repository. Click the Create Pipeline button. So Microclimate will create the pipeline for us and automatically kick off the Jenkins build. From here we can open the pipeline and access our Jenkins console using the credentials that we've set up. And here what we'll see is that Jenkins is going to start the build process. As the integrated pipeline is running, we can scroll down into and actually look at the details of the pipeline using the console output. This is standard Jenkins output. So it takes a few minutes for the pipeline to extract all of the components, pull down all of the Maven dependencies, but the build will continue to deployment to the IBM Cloud Private environment. From the Jenkins console, you can see the status of the build. The 4 stages that we had set up in our integrated pipeline is extracting the content from the GitLab repository, doing the Maven build, doing the Docker build, and then finally deploying the container out to the IBM Cloud Private environment. And once the pipeline deployment is complete, we can go over to our IBM Cloud Private environment and check out our new deployment of our stock quote demo application. So looking at the workloads, we can see a new deployment for a stock quote deployment in the namespace that we provided for Microclimate, and we can see that deployment is actually available and ready. In order to access the microservices, what we want to do is leverage the service endpoint that IBM Cloud Private and Kubernetes has established for us for the stock quote service. So from here, he exposes the endpoint as a node port for us, gives us a quick access to be able to launch the microservice right from the environment. Passing in the appropriate endpoint. We can see that our microservice is running in our IBM Cloud environment just as expected. So in this case, the microservice runs and does not return any error as a result of our microprofile retry that we added in to be able to provide some fault tolerance to our microservice. So that's it for the demo. Thank you very much.